The Allies stumbled across several established concentration camps as the Second World War drew to an end, and within the barbed wire walls, the actual atrocities of the Third Reich were unearthed. Many war crimes tribunals were conducted following the conflict in order to bring the offenders of the crimes against humanity at justice. Opening in 1933, Dachau was among the most infamous concentration camps and among the biggest ones overall. Executions were frequent in the camp to instill terror into the hearts of the prisoners of Dachau, who lived in continual fear of their approaching death from torture and other barbarous methods. Many of the liberated people were outraged by the sights of Dachau, and following the war the Dachau trials were conducted to bring those allegedly responsible for the estimated over 40,000 fatalities to justice. We consider the justified executions of the Dachau guards today. Please remember to support our channel via subscription. Opening on March 22, 1933, Dachau was the model camp for Germany. Originally designed to house political detainees, many other convicts found themselves within Dachau as persecution of the Jews grew more intense. Heinrich Himmler first opened it and established it as a site of forced labor. It developed over time to be a large camp with perhaps 100 smaller camps supporting Dachau. It contained about 5,000 inmates in its initial year, largely German communists, and those thought of as political rivals of Hitler's Nazi Party. Other groups, including Jehovah's Witnesses, Gypsies and Jews, were sent there, though. At Dachau, around 11,000 Jewish men were imprisoned following Kristallnacht. They were assigned to work in the armaments factory. The element of forced labor increased as the camp expanded. The guards mistreated the inmates and kept a very tight eye on them. Sometimes they actively encouraged the inmates, pilfers their headwear and throws them close to the perimeter fence. Often thinking they were trying to escape, the tower guards would shoot the captives when they went to retrieve them. Some inmates even chose to walk close to the fence and take their own lives so the guards might shoot them dead. Furthermore, rather prevalent were beatings. Detainees were beaten to death in cold blood. Like a medieval torture tool, torture was also extensively utilized. The SS soldiers strung the captives up to trees using their arms, then held behind their backs, causing them suffering the manacles. Executions also took place in public. The guards hung any prisoner who committed an indiscretion, and these usually took place in the roll call yard on front of all. Prisoners were expected to stand there for hours, and a crematoria opened its doors in 1942. Many of the deaths at Dachau were hidden using these ovens. Gas chambers also existed at the camp. Many people who were not fit enough to work or had even stolen a meager amount of food to save their life were executed inside a firing range. The conditions within the camp started to drastically worsen when the Second World War turned against the Germans. As prisoners from camps nearer the front lines were force-marched on death marches back to other camps, several of Germany's camps started to get packed. This happened at Dachau, and it severely taxed resources. There was a terrible shortage of food there, and disease was becoming a major problem since the overcrowding encouraged typhus outbreaks to develop that resulted in a great death count in the latter days of the camp. Often there was nowhere to sleep, and in the last 6 months before release, the conditions at Dachau claimed to have killed 15,000 captives. Also 500 Soviet POWs were shot dead. The last group was dispatched on April 19, 1945. The inmates continued arriving. The U.S. Army was well into Germany, into Bavaria in this month. To try to save more lives, it was suggested to Himmler that he pass the camp to the Allies. Declaring, "No prisoner shall be allowed to fall into the hands of the enemy alive," he turned away, handing over Dachau. With everyone unable to keep up being shot, the commandant and the SS guards had sent 7,000 inmates on a death march just before the Allies arrived. The SS firing from mass graves containing hundreds of inmates revealed many dead from the tiredness. Although 200 deaths were recorded daily by April 1945, soldiers from the 3rd Battalion 157th Infantry Regiment and the 45th Infantry Division arrived in Dachau on April 29. They discovered heaven on earth. Even before they arrived at the camp, they came upon 29 railway boxcars with about 2,000 dead bodies. Death awaited them everywhere, the air was thick with dead bodies and misery. Some buildings and horses had bodies stacked from floor to ceiling, many of the deceased had been left for days. The stench of death was intense, one liberator said. Along with many of the SS guards accountable for the murders at Dachau, the camp's commandant Martin Weiss had left the camp at the time, and a Untersturmführer Heinrich Wickett was assigned command with more than 500 men. Inside the camp, it was stated that several of the SS guards still carried firearms, and despite their seizure, more bloodshed occurred. Meeting the U.S. Army, a Swiss Red Cross official intended to release the camp. Disgusted with what they observed, several American soldiers chose to take justice into their own hands. Instead, they executed many of the guards there and then, acting with quick savage reprisals. This resulted in the shooting of several guards. Yet, during the cleanup operations post-war prosecutions concerning the atrocities at Dachau were conducted. Designed to provide justice for the crimes carried out, the Dachau camp trials took place from the November 15 until the December 15, 1945. 40 persons were accused of war crimes particularly connected to Dachau and the sub-camps. The trial was formally named United States of America v. Martin Gottfried Weiss et al. Many of Dachau's guards and leaders were taken prisoner as investigations sought those accountable. Accused of helping in the maltreatment and murder of Allied citizens and POWs, the charges were war crimes carried out against Allied civilians and prisoners of war in Dachau. Opening on November 15 at 10 a.m., the court heard the prosecution present the charges against the accused. The judges then delineated the court's lawfulness and what would follow. The defense produced motions challenging the court's legitimacy, but this was turned aside. The defendants all said not guilty when asked how they pled. Both sides heard evidence, and the prosecution included many pictures and relics taken from the camps, including the book recording the deaths. Their testimonies against the guards from former inmates was also rather horrifying. The courtroom heard innumerable tales of beatings, sickness, inadequate sanitation and a lack of food, public executions, murders and medical experimentation. The defense responded with 93 witnesses, including those on trial, as well as cross-examinations. Those employed at the camp were accused of mistreating and killing detainees as well as of participating in executions. Declaring the death of the condemned, the camp doctors were entrusted with participating in executions as well as in selecting actions that would lead to prisoner death. Those who collaborated with the commander were accused of generally bearing responsibility for the crimes and conditions that developed in the camp. The 40 people under trial differed in their positions in the camp. The camp's commandant, Martin Weiss, who watched over the circumstances there, was the most senior person. His adjutant joined him on the dock. Many other Dachau guards and staff members also accompanied him. Other sub-camps had leaders, and one fascinating defendant was elderly 74-year-old Dr. Klaus Schilling, who tried to explain his human experiments to the courtroom by claiming they were carried out for medical benefit. This was obviously discounted. Other guards and capos who worked in the cremation were under trial, and the Dachau camp trial produced a lot of death sentence decisions. Those employed at Dachau were given 36 death sentences. They were to be executed for their crimes. Many of these death penalties for less senior staff members were applied. Among those executed were Friedrich Ruppert, the commandant Martin Weiss, Klaus Schilling, Otto Moll, who took part in the death marches. Every condemned person whose sentence was not altered was sent to Landsberg prison, the scene of their execution. These were done on the 28th and 29th, 1946. 2 days were thus required to administer the penalties since so many persons were sentenced to death. A gallows had been built in the jail courtyard and manned by U.S. military personnel who would be carrying out the killings. Many more officials were present to monitor the events. Many guards pulled each of the condemned out from their cells, and before they ascended the gallows, their identity was verified. At the bottom of the stairs, the death sentence was likewise announced, and several guards surrounded both sides. Additionally sent there to attend on the condemned till their last moments was a priest. Once asked for any last words, these were noted. Then every one of the condemned was taken up the steep stairs to see their executioner. The guys were subsequently given over to the executioner, who covered their heads with a black hood. Their priest stayed with them, then the executioner securely tightened the rope around the necks of the condemned Dachau staff. Everything was ready after the knots were verified, and then they stood there with the noose around their necks for several seconds. The priest then spoke a last few words before the executioner opened the trapdoor, therefore killing the guys. A little while later, the men's bodies were cut down and placed in a casket with their names along with a wooden cross. Morosely the condemned would have seen their coffins as they headed to the gallows with their names engraved upon the wooden box. The doctors underneath the trapdoor certified death very soon. Many of the executions took place in front of a small gathering of us army officials and soldiers within the prison courtyard. The officials would gather the next prisoner following every execution. The executioner would stay on the scaffold. Although 28 of the former guards and staff members of the Dachau camp trials were executed at the gallows, the trials produced many more court proceedings wherein additional guards were brought to justice. Following it were 121 secondary trials involving around 500 people before a judge, with more death penalties and prison terms administered to others employed at the main camp. 6 years after the first ones were executed, those who worked at Dachau until 1951 were also executed at Landsberg prison. These death sentences served as some type of atonement for the horror that was committed there for those victims of the camp and for those who suffered under the hands of the staff and guards. Again, I appreciate your viewing. Please consider subscription to help. Again, I appreciate you viewing.